And this is something that I don't think we ever kind of had to ponder could be a possibility, I think, until recent years. But, he was asked this question on the weekend, but he's been asked this question several times, and he tends to sort of really play coy with the answer. So let's just start with the basics. Does a president have to leave the White House in order for a transfer of power to occur? Perhaps. Like, say, for example, a president just refused to leave the White House.
Well, I spent the past few days talking to constitutional law scholars and election experts, and what I found is that the president can challenge the results legally, and we'll kind of get into that, but if the results are confirmed, he has to leave. The 20th Amendment says that your term is up on January 20th. The new president takes over. Our CBS News legal analyst, Jonathan Turley, told me that, if once the new president is inaugurated, the Secret Service is assigned to that president, and if someone remains in the White House, they are an unwelcomed guest, and they can be escorted out. But what's at issue here is not necessarily whether the president would refuse to leave, it's whether he would accept the results and perhaps challenge them. And it's really important because this peaceful transition of power is not only dictated by the 20th Amendment, it's also a important tradition in this country. No matter how bitter these campaigns are, and they've been increasingly partisan and really rough, that on January 20th, the new president takes over and the power is transferred peacefully and the country moves on. And that's really a hallmark of our democracy. But because we have a lot of questions being raised about what this election might look like in a pandemic, we're going to see an increase in mail-in voting. States are already scaling up, as we've talked about. There are going to be a lot of people wanting to vote by mail instead of showing up to polling locations because of fears of coronavirus. And so what you have is President Trump consistently disparaging mail-in voting and raising questions about the legitimacy of the results. And that's why these questions are being raised. And it's important to note that he is not committing either way to acknowledge the results.
So it's a fascinating discussion, Caitlin. And, years ago when I was a foreign correspondent in Africa, I was having a conversation with a colleague, an acquaintance, and we were talking about President Harry Truman when he decided to fire Douglas MacArthur for actions in Korea. It's a long story. People can look it up or check it out in a history book. But I remember this one colleague saying to me, well, and he was from an African country, he said, well, if this Douglas MacArthur was as powerful as you say that he was and was as respected as you say he was, and Harry Truman at the time was not as popular as Douglas MacArthur, why wouldn't Douglas MacArthur just use the military and seize power if he thought he was doing the right thing and he thought President Truman was wrong? And I had to explain to him, as you just did, that this peaceful transfer of power that we have, this separation of the military where the commander-in-chief of our armed forces is a civilian as opposed to a lot of other countries, that was the hallmark of an American democracy. I'm old enough to have lived through the 2000 dispute between President Bush and the candidate then at the time, Albert Gore, the former vice president. What would President Trump do to dispute the result? How would he do that?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I went down lots of different rabbit holes through the 2000 election and also talking to scholars about elections in the 1800s, which were very contentious. In 1876, the president wasn't determined until 2 days before inauguration. So things could get worse. But what is at issue here is not necessarily whether the president would leave. It comes down to that there could be some legal battles contesting results. And if we could kind of just step back for a second and kind of explain how these elections work. Everybody goes to the polls in some way or cast their ballots by mail on November 3rd. States have until 35 days after the election, which is going to be December 8th, to submit their results and assign electors according to the popular vote in their states. There are two exceptions: Maine and Nebraska delegate electors proportionately. Those electors meet on December 14th, and then those results go to Congress. Congress, and Congress essentially certifies them. So once Congress certifies them, the election is done. Those decisions are made. So that means that whoever wins is determined by Congress, that person wins. But what could be at issue here, and what we're going to be looking for, and the reason that I've been reporting a lot on how we may not know the results on election night because a lot of these states are going to be have to take a while to count in all these mail-in ballots, what you could have, and what we've seen the president do in the past, is raise doubts about those mail-in ballots. Remember, President Trump won in 2016, but he still challenged the results of his own election, claiming there was fraud. Remember, he established a commission to investigate fraud. They found nothing and had to disband. In 2018, during the midterms, he was raising doubts about the election in Florida, saying that these mail-in votes were coming in and the election night vote should be counted and that's what should count. And so a lot of people can kind of imagine those questions being raised again in 2020, if in fact what we see the results in-person polling coming in on election night and we're waiting for mail-in ballots to be processed. You can imagine, just given the president's past comments, that he could raise doubts about that. So that's something important to keep in mind. Now, most states allow a candidate or a campaign or someone to challenge the results, but many of them require the threshold between the two candidates to be very, very slim. That's something that we saw take place in Florida in 2000, and we of course know that ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court. So certainly anybody can challenge the results, and there are legal ways to do that. The deadlines, though, are very limited, and the thresholds are limited as well.
You raised the president's repeated assertion that mail-in ballots, absentee ballots, are particularly vulnerable to fraud, even though we have no proof of that, and mail-in ballots have been used successfully in many, many elections. But I want to ask you, even without proof, are mail-in ballots particularly vulnerable to legal challenges, even if there isn't really, a type of fraud hasn't been identified? Could the election still be held up because of the large number of mail-in ballots?
Yeah, it's a great question. And while we haven't seen large-scale fraud cases in mail-in balloting in the past, and 5 states do their elections entirely by mail. We've seen since the pandemic, a lot of states have said that they're going to expand their vote-by-mail operations. But what's different about this election is that a lot of these states are going to be seeing a surge in mail-in ballots that they haven't seen before. Take Pennsylvania, for example. In the primary a couple of months ago, they saw for the first time more people vote by mail than come and vote in person. And so that is kind of setting the stage for November. Now, election officials say that they are they value the integrity of the election. That's of the utmost importance. That fraud is very, very rare. But we haven't seen vote by mail at this scale yet. And why I've been reporting that we're going to we should anticipate a delay in the results is because a lot of these states don't allow you to start even opening up these mail-in ballots until election day. And a lot of these states are already, struggling for some resources. There's going to likely be a shortage of poll workers, for example. And so this is putting an extra strain on the states. It's also important to note that there could be a lot of legal challenges because some people will be voting by mail for the first time. The process could be confusing. You have to sign everything. You have to get it in the mail in time. They have to receive it in time. So there could be all these complications that are not quite foreseen that could lead to challenges really on both sides. And so that's why you have election officials kind of sounding the alarm now, saying, look, this is going to take a while, spending a lot of money and time and resources on educating voters about how to actually vote by mail and making sure they sign it. So there are lots of challenges associated with vote by mail, not necessarily with fraud. Again, there haven't been a lot of cases proven, but the idea that a lot of people are going to be doing this for the first time and it could be confusing.
Yeah, look, Caitlin, over the last couple of years, we've seen, and especially in the last couple of special elections, we've seen people turning up at the polls even in the midst of COVID-19. It strikes me that people are willing now to go vote in person because of some of the points that you raise, and they're willing to do it even if it puts themselves at jeopardy as long as they socially distance. So we'll have to see what happens. But this is really fascinating reporting, and we thank you for doing it. I know you put a lot of work into it. This is great. Thank you.
Thank you.